Flight attendant kicks elderly black woman out of first class, but 7 minutes later, no one saw this coming. Aaliyah Johnson stepped onto the plane, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her designer laptop bag slung effortlessly over her shoulder. First-class travel wasn't a luxury for her. It was a hard-earned reward. Years of relentless work, sleepless nights, and courtroom battles had put her here. She slid into her plush seat, exhaled slowly, and let the quiet hum of the engines settle over her. This flight was supposed to be a moment of peace before the chaos of her upcoming civil rights case. But peace wasn't in the cards. A shadow loomed over her. "Mom?" The voice was polite, too polite. Aaliyah opened her eyes to see a flight attendant standing at her row, blonde hair twisted into a pristine knot, uniform crisp, smile tight. She held out a manicured hand. "May I see your ticket?" Aaliyah didn't hesitate. She retrieved the boarding pass from her blazer pocket and handed it over. The attendant, Natalie Parker, according to her name tag, stared at it for longer than necessary, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Ah," Natalie murmured, handing it back with a practiced smile. "Just needed to check. Sometimes passengers get confused about their seating." Aaliyah met her gaze, her voice steady. "Not me. I know exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Of course," Natalie said, her laugh forced, her smile strained. But she lingered a moment too long before muttering under her breath, "First class isn't what it used to be." Aaliyah's grip tightened around her phone. She could have let it slide, could have brushed it off. But then it kept happening. Delayed service at her row. A tray table accidentally bumped, sending water splashing into her lap. Subtle glances exchanged between the crew. And then the whisper, barely audible, but not quiet enough. "Double check if she's even supposed to be here," Natalie murmured to another attendant. "We can't take chances these days." 15 minutes into the flight, subtlety was gone. Natalie was back, clipboard in hand, her smile stretched even thinner. "Ma'am," she said, her voice adopting a rehearsed professionalism, "there may have been an error with your seating assignment. Would you mind moving to the main cabin? We'll ensure your comfort there." Aaliyah leaned back, her expression unreadable. "This is the seat I paid for. If there's an error, take it up with whoever assigned it, because it's not me." A faint flush crept up Natalie's neck. She shifted the clipboard, her fingers tightening around the edges. "I'm sure we can resolve this without any fuss." "I agree," Aaliyah said coolly. "There's no fuss. I'm staying in my seat." A murmur rippled through first class. A man in an adjacent row lowered his tablet. Another passenger whispered to their seatmate. The growing attention only seemed to rattle Natalie further. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Look," she said, the forced politeness slipping. "We both know how these things happen. Sometimes people end up in the wrong place, even if it's not intentional. I'm just trying to make sure everything is in order." Aaliyah's stomach tightened, but she didn't waver. "People like me, you mean?" Natalie blinked. Her surprise flickered into irritation. "That's not what I said." "No," Aaliyah said, voice razor-sharp. "But it's exactly what you implied." A hush fell over the cabin. Natalie's practiced facade cracked, her grip on the clipboard white-knuckled. "I'm giving you a chance to resolve this quietly," she hissed. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Aaliyah didn't flinch. "The only person making this hard is you." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their cruising altitude. Natalie hesitated before straightening, her lips pressed into a tight line as she stalked. Down the aisle, Aaliyah exhaled, pulse steady but guard up. She could feel the stares around her, some supportive, some indifferent, some openly judging. But she wasn't going anywhere. Minutes passed. Then Natalie returned. This time she wasn't alone. Another flight attendant trailed behind her, a younger woman, clearly nervous. "She's refusing to move," Natalie said sharply, though she kept her voice low enough to avoid drawing the cockpit's attention. "I need you to back me up." The younger attendant hesitated, glancing at Aaliyah. I don't think this is—" "Just do your job," Natalie snapped. Aaliyah folded her arms. "Let me save you some time. If you plan to escalate this, go right ahead. My lawyer would love to hear how your airline treats paying customers." Nearby, passengers leaned in now, openly interested. Natalie stiffened, her confidence cracked under the weight of the scrutiny. Still, she leaned down one last time, voice venomous. "You people always make everything about race." Aaliyah's gaze didn't waver. "And you people always pretend it isn't." Natalie straightened, blotchy with anger, before storming down the aisle. Aaliyah let out a slow breath. The tension in the cabin lingered, thick and unspoken. But it didn't matter. She wasn't moving. She paid for this seat, and she wasn't backing down. "Because that's exactly what this is," Aaliyah said, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "You haven't questioned anyone else in this cabin, just me, and everyone here knows it." For a moment, no one spoke. The tension was suffocating, crackling like static in the air. Then, from 2 rows back, a voice shattered the silence. "She's right." A middle-aged woman sat forward, her expression resolute, her voice steady despite its softness. "I've been watching the whole time. You're singling her out." Natalie's head snapped toward the woman, her nostrils flaring. "This has nothing to do with anyone else," she bit out, her voice high, with barely restrained anger. "I'm simply following protocol." The woman crossed her arms. "Sure you are. And I suppose protocol includes whispering about her under your breath?" A ripple spread through the cabin. The murmurs that had once been hushed were now shifting, no longer just idle whispers, but outright questioning. Some passengers exchanged knowing looks. Others leaned into their seatmates, muttering. A few still sat stiffly, choosing silence. Over confrontation, Natalie's carefully crafted composure was starting to crack. Her eyes darted toward the galley, searching for backup, but the younger flight attendant who had been shadowing her moments ago suddenly found somewhere else to be, disappearing down the aisle without so much as a glance back. Meanwhile, in coach, Michael Rivera adjusted his camera. He had been recording the exchange from the start, instinctively knowing this moment needed to be documented. His lens remained trained on the standoff, capturing every second of it. Natalie straightened, trying to reclaim control. "I don't have to explain myself to any of you," she snapped. "I am in charge of this cabin, and I will decide what is appropriate." Aaliyah didn't even blink. "No," she said coolly, "what you will do is stop harassing me and do your job, unless, of course, you'd like me to escalate this further." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Natalie's face. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, recalculating. But Aaliyah saw it, the hesitation, the fear of pushing too far in front of so many witnesses. Still, Natalie lifted her chin, trying to summon whatever authority she had left. "You want to escalate this?" she hissed. "Fine. I'll bring the captain into this." "Please do," Aaliyah said, barely concealing a smirk as she gestured toward the cockpit. "Let's see how far you're willing to take this." Natalie hesitated, jaw clenched, before turning on her heel and marching toward the front of the plane. Her heels struck the floor in sharp, angry clicks. The moment she disappeared, the murmurs exploded into full-fledged discussion. Aaliyah exhaled slowly, her pulse steady, but her guard still up. The woman who had spoken up earlier caught her eye. Aaliyah gave her a small, grateful nod. Moments later, Natalie returned, this time with the captain. His face was carefully neutral, but his posture was stiff with irritation. He approached Aaliyah's seat, his voice measured but edged with fatigue. "What seems to be the issue here?" Natalie jumped in before Aaliyah could answer, spinning her own version of events, painting Aaliyah as uncooperative and disruptive. But before she could finish, Aaliyah cut in. "Captain," she said, her tone sharp and unwavering, I'm sitting in the seat I paid for, and this flight attendant has been harassing me from the moment I stepped on this plane. Her behavior is unacceptable, and I have witnesses to prove it." The captain's expression darkened. His gaze flicked to the surrounding passengers. Several heads nodded immediately. "I've seen everything," a man in a business suit spoke up. "She's been targeting her for no reason." Natalie's face flushed red. Her lips moved, searching for an argument, but nothing came out. The captain sighed, clearly recalculating. "Miss Parker," he said finally, his voice clipped, "can I speak to you in the galley?" Natalie stiffened, her grip tightening on her clipboard. She opened her mouth, about to protest, but one look at the captain's expression shut her up. With a sharp inhale, she spun around and stormed off toward the galley. For the first time, Aaliyah felt a flicker of relief. Maybe, just maybe, this was over, but she should have known better. The captain returned, his expression carefully schooled, but the tension in his posture betrayed his frustration. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice deliberately measured, "I understand there's been a misunderstanding with your seat assignment. Miss Parker has raised concerns about an irregular booking. To ensure there are no further disruptions, I kindly ask that you move to the main cabin." Aaliyah stared at him, her mind momentarily blank with disbelief. Then her lips curled into a slow, disbelieving smile. "Let me get this straight," she said, voice like steel. "You're asking me, a paying customer, to move because your flight attendant can't handle seeing me in this seat." The captain's jaw tightened, his professionalism fraying at the edges. "I'm asking for your cooperation to ensure the flight proceeds smoothly." "Smoothly?" Aaliyah repeated, heat rising in her chest. "The only disruption here is the blatant racism I've been subjected to since I boarded this plane, and I refuse to be punished for her behavior." Before the captain could respond, Natalie reappeared, her clipboard clutched like a weapon, a smug look creeping across her face. "Captain," she interjected, her voice thick with fake professionalism, "I just confirmed with corporate. Miss Johnson's seat was flagged due to a glitch in the booking system. It wasn't officially cleared for her use." Aaliyah's stomach twisted, rage boiling beneath her skin. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice deceptively calm. Natalie's fake sympathy dripped from her words. "These things happen. We're happy to accommodate you in the main cabin and, of course, offer a voucher for the inconvenience." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Some passengers looked horrified. Others nodded along, complicit in their silence. "You can't be serious," Aaliyah said, her voice like a blade. "This is nothing more than another attempt to humiliate me." Natalie leaned in slightly, her voice a whisper laced with venom. "If you don't move now, I'll have security waiting for you when we land. Your choice." For the first time, Aaliyah hesitated. She could already see the headlines, the twisting of the story, the attempts to destroy her dignity. She inhaled sharply. Then, slowly, she stood, grabbing her bag. "I'll move," she said, voice strong. "But not because you're right. Because this isn't over. And when I'm done with this, you'll wish you'd handled it differently." Natalie's smirk faltered. Aaliyah didn't give her the satisfaction of another glance. Chin high, spine straight, she walked down the aisle. The weight of humiliation pressed against her, but she refused to let it show. As she reached the main cabin, Michael Rivera stood, his voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't right," he said loud and clear. "Everyone saw what just happened. Don't think for a second this won't go public." Aaliyah met his gaze, giving him a nod of quiet gratitude. Then she settled into her new seat, her hands trembling. Slightly as she opened her laptop, her fingers moved furiously across the keyboard, documenting everything. Every word, every action, every injustice. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Michael kept his camera steady, tracking Natalie as she navigated the cabin like a cornered animal. The confidence she once wore like armor had cracked, revealing something raw beneath. The realization that she was losing control. A ding cut through the tension. The older woman who had called her out earlier had pressed the call button, her expression unreadable. Natalie hesitated for half a second before smoothing her uniform, pasting on that brittle smile, and stepping forward. "Yes, ma'am? How can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. The woman didn't blink. "You can explain why you thought it was appropriate to humiliate that woman earlier." The words sliced through the cabins. Low murmur, sending a fresh wave of tension rippling through the passengers. Natalie's smile faltered. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," she said, but there was a crack in her polished tone now, a tiny fracture threatening to splinter. The woman wasn't having it. "Oh, spare me. We all saw it. You've been targeting that woman since she stepped on this plane, and quite frankly, it's disgusting." She glanced around as if daring anyone to disagree. No one did. Instead, nods of agreement rippled through the cabin, and a young man across the aisle spoke up. "Yeah, I heard it too. You crossed a line." Natalie's head snapped toward him, her professional mask slipping entirely. "I don't need to explain myself to you," she snapped, her voice laced with something sharp. Panic. The older woman tilted her head, her voice turning eerily calm. "You may not need to explain yourself to him," she said, "but you'll have a lot to answer for when this goes public." Natalie's breath hitched. Her eyes darted toward Michael. His phone was no longer discreet. It was out in the open, recording everything. Her face drained of color as the reality sank in. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed toward the galley, her muttered curses swallowed by the cabin noise. In the main cabin, Alia's phone vibrated on her tray. Table. She glanced down, a text from an unknown number. "I've got everything on video. This isn't over. Stay strong." Michael. For the first time in hours, a spark of something other than frustration ignited in her chest. "Hope." She typed back quickly. "Thank you. I've been documenting everything too." The rest of the flight passed in thick, uneasy silence. Natalie stayed. Out of sight. Alia kept typing, her fingers flying over the keyboard, every moment of the confrontation immortalized in black and white. Every now and then, Michael looked back, offering her a nod of silent solidarity. As the plane began its descent into LAX, the tension in the cabin became suffocating. When Natalie finally emerged from the galley, she moved with forced composure, her eyes carefully avoiding the passengers' lingering stares. But Alia caught something in her expression, a flicker of fear. When the wheels hit the runway, Alia let out a slow breath, steadying herself. This wasn't over. If anything, the real fight was just beginning. Up in first class, Michael powered down his camera, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. He had all the proof he needed, and judging by the hushed, furious conversations around him, he wasn't the only one who planned to make noise about this. As passengers gathered their belongings, Alia remained seated, bracing for the next step. A movement caught her eye. The young flight attendant from earlier hesitated near her row, glancing over her shoulder before leaning in. "I just wanted to say," her voice was barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry for what happened to you. It wasn't fair." Alia studied her. "Then why didn't you say anything?" Her voice was calm but firm. The flight attendant's shoulders sagged. "I was scared. Natalie can be difficult." "Fear doesn't excuse silence," Alia said evenly. The young woman swallowed hard and nodded. "You're right. I should have said something." Alia didn't linger. Without another word, she grabbed her bag and headed for the jet bridge, and there, waiting like a final obstacle, stood Natalie. Her professional mask was back in place, but Alia could see the cracks forming beneath it. "Have a good day," Natalie said flatly, avoiding her gaze. Alia stopped. Her voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "Remember this day. It'll stay. With you, Natalie stiffened, but Aaliyah didn't wait for a response. She walked past without another glance. As she entered the terminal, she spotted a small crowd gathering near the gate. Passengers whispering, faces tight with outrage and curiosity, and in the center of it all, Michael. He stood with a woman, holding a notepad, speaking in low, serious tones, his camera still hanging around his neck, ready to capture whatever came next. He saw her and raised his voice just enough to command attention. "Miss Johnson," he called out, his tone firm, encouraging. "Would you like to say something about what happened?" The surrounding conversations died down. The crowd turned toward her, eyes expectant. For a split second, Aaliyah hesitated. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. This was it, her chance to speak, to make sure this didn't get buried. But then she remembered the sting of Natalie's smirk, the whispered comments, the humiliation. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and faced them head-on. "What happened on that flight was unacceptable," she said, her voice clear, unwavering. "I was targeted and humiliated because of someone else's prejudice. I deserve better, and so does everyone who flies with this airline." A few passengers nodded. Someone clapped. The woman with the notepad scribbled furiously. And then, like a storm cloud rolling in, Natalie appeared from the jet bridge. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. But it was her eyes that gave her away. Darting over the crowd, narrowing when she saw Michael's camera, Michael stepped forward. "Natalie Parker," he said, voice calm but pointed. "Do you have anything to say about your treatment of Miss Johnson?" Silence. Aaliyah could see the battle raging behind Natalie's expression, the desperate scramble for a way out. Finally, her lips parted. "No comment," she snapped. Then, without waiting, she turned and stormed toward the exit, her steps quick, almost frantic. The crowd erupted, voices raised in outrage and disbelief. Aaliyah didn't move, watching Natalie's retreat with a quiet, steady satisfaction. The Empower had shifted. The flight attendant who once held control was now running from the consequences. Then, Aaliyah's phone buzzed. She glanced down. A notification. A hashtag flying while black already trending. Her breath caught as she clicked it. The flood of messages hit instantly. Hundreds of comments, angry, empathetic, outraged. Michael's footage had already gone viral. People were demanding accountability. Strangers were sharing their own stories. Aaliyah's grip on her phone tightened. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Aaliyah's pulse pounded in her ears as she scrolled through the flood of messages. Strangers, thousands of them, stood with her. It wasn't just her battle anymore. This had become something bigger, something unstoppable. The weight of injustice that had pressed down on her chest for hours now felt like fuel, igniting a fire deep within her. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "This is only the beginning," she murmured. Natalie Parker wasn't walking away from this unscathed. And the airline? They wouldn't be able to hide behind corporate statements and hollow policies anymore. She looked up. Michael was watching her, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the footage on his camera. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. No words were needed, just a sharp nod. They understood. This fight wasn't over. But for the first time, Aaliyah wasn't carrying it alone. Stepping outside, the crisp Los Angeles air cut through the chaos buzzing in her mind. Her phone vibrated, once, twice, then a relentless flurry of notifications. The video was spreading like wildfire. Millions had seen it, millions were talking, and with every share, every comment demanding accountability, the airline's grip on the situation slipped further. But as powerful as the moment felt, the sheer scale of it was suffocating. "Aaliyah!" The voice behind her pulled her back. She turned to see Michael jogging toward her, his camera swinging from his shoulder, like a weapon of truth. He was breathless but steady. "I'm glad I caught you." His brow furrowed. concern flickering in his eyes. "Look, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what you went through back there. It was disgusting, truly. I uploaded the footage, and it's already exploding." She studied him, weighing his words. Gratitude stirred inside her. But so did suspicion. Her voice was calm, but her gaze sharpened. "Why are you doing this?" she asked bluntly. "What's in it for you?" Michael hesitated for only a moment before answering. "I'm a journalist. This is what I do, but I'm also just someone who's sick of seeing stories like this over and over again. If I can expose the truth, maybe it makes a difference." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was honest. Aaliyah gave a slow nod. "Thank you." They walked toward baggage claim, tension still thick in the air. Michael glanced at his phone, his jaw tightening. "It's not just the footage," he said. "People are digging into her history. Natalie Parker, there are other complaints against her." Aaliyah stopped in her tracks, the words slamming into her. "What complaints?" Michael lowered his voice. "Passengers, crew. She's been accused of this before, but those complaints, they were buried. None of them went public until now." Aaliyah's hands curled into fists, her voice dropping into a furious whisper. "Of course they were buried. That's how this always works." Michael placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. His voice was quiet, but firm. "Not this time. The airline knows they can't contain this. They're scrambling." Before Aaliyah could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't another notification. It was a call. She glanced at the screen, and her stomach twisted. The airline's customer service number. For a moment she hesitated. Then, with a slow inhale, she answered. "This is Aaliyah Johnson." "Miss Johnson," a clipped professional voice responded. "This is Rachel Bennett, legal counsel for—" Aaliyah cut her off, her tone ice-cold. "I assume you're calling to fix the PR disaster your airline created." Rachel hesitated, but then pressed on, carefully measured. "We are aware of the incident on today's flight and would like to discuss a resolution." Aaliyah's lips curled into a mirthless smile. "A resolution," she echoed. "Let me guess. An apology? A travel voucher? A half-hearted promise to do better?" There was silence on the other end. Then Rachel's voice came again, smooth but firm. "We are prepared to discuss compensation, but we'd appreciate it if you refrained from making further public statements while we conduct an internal investigation." A sharp laugh escaped Aaliyah before she could stop it. "Publicity," she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. "That's what you're worried about? Not the fact that I was humiliated and discriminated against? Your flight attendant acted with blatant racism. Do you really think throwing money at me is going to make that go away?" "Miss Johnson, we take these matters very seriously," Rachel started, but Aaliyah was done playing. "No, you don't," she shot back. "If you did, you wouldn't need a trending hashtag to deal with it. Call me back when you're ready to do better." And with that, she hung up. Her hands trembled slightly as she set her phone down, but not from fear, from rage, from determination. Michael studied her, his voice quiet but admiring. "You okay?" Aaliyah squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze. "I'm fine," she said. "They're scared, which means we're finally getting somewhere." As they stepped into baggage claim, a cluster of reporters waited near the exit, cameras already rolling. The second they spotted her, the questions came flying. Michael leaned in. "You don't have to talk to them if you're not ready." Aaliyah took a breath, steadied herself. "Yes, I do," she said. "This isn't just about me anymore." She stepped forward, the bright lights flashing, the questions roaring around her. But she wasn't afraid, not anymore, because this fight wasn't just hers, and she wasn't backing down. Rachel's voice was sharp, cutting through the tense boardroom air. "We need to be ready for a lawsuit. Miss Johnson isn't backing down." And she was right. Across the city, in her apartment, Aaliyah was already preparing for battle. Her desk was cluttered with notes, screenshots, and timestamps, every detail meticulously documented. The fight wasn't just personal anymore, it was systemic. It was about exposing a pattern, a culture, an entire institution built to protect the powerful at the expense of people like her. A notification flashed on her phone. The airline had just released a statement. Aaliyah clicked the link, her eyes scanning the carefully worded PR damage control. "We are aware of the incident involving Ms. Aaliyah Johnson on Flight 347 and are conducting a thorough investigation. We take these matters seriously and are committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with dignity and respect. We sincerely apologize for any distress caused and are working to address the situation." Aaliyah scoffed. Textbook corporate deflection, just enough to appear concerned but vague enough to avoid real accountability. It wasn't an apology. It was a shield. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Michael. "Don't let up." A slow, grim smile touched her lips. Michael was right. This was nothing. A throwaway statement meant to quiet the storm, but the storm wasn't dying down. It was only growing. She opened her laptop. If the airline thought they could seize control of the narrative, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Momentum surged. News outlets picked up the story. Interview requests flooded her inbox. Social media was on fire, and hashtags demanding justice trended worldwide. But this wasn't just about Aaliyah anymore. Natalie Parker's name had entered the fray. And, with it, a trail of past misconduct surfaced, each new report dragging the airline deeper into the abyss. Aaliyah woke the next morning to an avalanche of notifications. Michael's video had gone nuclear overnight, turning the scandal into an international flashpoint. As she sipped her coffee, scrolling through the latest updates, her phone rang. Charles Porter. "Morning, Charles," she greeted, setting down her mug. "Morning, Aaliyah," he replied, his tone razor-sharp. "I've reviewed the footage and your documentation. We have them cornered. Their apology won't withstand the public backlash. Sooner or later they'll have no choice but to respond to a lawsuit." "They're already scrambling," Aaliyah mused, leaning back. "But I'm not interested in their performative apologies." "Good," Charles said. "I've drafted a formal demand letter, but I need your final approval before we send it. Also, I've lined up interviews with legal analysts to get ahead of their inevitable smear tactics." "Send me the draft," Aaliyah said. As soon as she ended the call, another notification popped up. A new video. A former flight attendant had come forward. Aaliyah clicked the link, her stomach tightening as the woman began to speak. "My name is Lauren Davis," the woman said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I worked with Natalie Parker for over 3 years. What happened to Ms. Johnson doesn't surprise me at all. Natalie has a history of targeting passengers, especially people of color. I reported her behavior multiple times, but nothing was ever done." Lauren went on, detailing incident after incident, each one another nail in the coffin, each one further. Proof that the airline hadn't just failed, they had allowed this to happen. By the time the video ended, Aaliyah's anger had reignited, sharper than ever. This wasn't just about Natalie Parker. This was about an entire system that had protected her, and now it was unraveling. Across town, in a dimly lit apartment, Natalie Parker sat frozen in front of her laptop, watching the scandal consume her life. Legal documents littered the table. The news played on a loop, her name flashing across the screen, her actions dissected by every outlet imaginable. Even her neighbors had started avoiding her. Her phone rang. She hesitated, answered. "Natalie," Rachel Bennett's voice was curt. "We need to discuss damage control." Natalie's grip tightened. "Damage control?" she snapped. "What about my side of the story?" "There is no side of the story that justifies your actions," Rachel shot back, blunt and cold. "The video speaks for itself, And now former employees are coming forward with additional allegations. You've put us in an impossible position. Natalie's chest tightened. I was following protocol, she argued, voice rising. She didn't belong in first class. I was just doing my job. Enough! Rachel's voice cut like a blade. Your behavior has caused massive PR damage. We're facing a potential lawsuit, and if more passengers come forward, it could escalate into a class action case. Natalie's breath hitched. What are you saying? You're being placed on unpaid leave, effective immediately. Rachel's tone was final, devoid of sympathy. You are not to speak to the media. You are not to issue a statement. The airline will be handling this, and Natalie... A pause. This isn't up for debate. The line went dead. Natalie sat there, staring at her screen, the weight of reality crashing down on her. Back in her apartment, Aaliyah felt something shift inside her, a renewed sense of purpose. Natalie Parker's reckoning was just one step in a much larger war, and Aaliyah, she was more than ready to see it through. Her phone buzzed. Michael, have you seen the latest? His voice was electric, barely containing. His excitement. If you mean the former flight attendant's video, yes. Aaliyah's tone was calm, but there was a flicker of satisfaction. It's blowing up, Michael said. And it's not just her. More employees are coming forward. This isn't just a scandal anymore, it's a reckoning. Aaliyah leaned back, a slow smile forming. Good, she said. The more people speak out, the harder it'll be for the airline to bury this. Michael hesitated. You ready for what's next? This is going to get even bigger before it gets better. Aaliyah's jaw tightened. Her resolve burned brighter than ever. I'm ready, she said. By midday, the story had reached its boiling point. The airline scrambled to issue a second apology. This time, they directly acknowledged Natalie's behavior. They promised a full review of company policies, but it wasn't enough. The public saw through the corporate theatrics. Critics slammed them for scapegoating one employee instead of addressing the system that had enabled her. The backlash only intensified. Aaliyah scrolled through the flood of responses. Her phone buzzed. A text from Charles. Demand letter sent. Expect their legal team's response shortly. Stay strong. Aaliyah stared at the message for a moment, then set her phone down. A quiet focus settled over her. The airline had underestimated her. Natalie had underestimated her. That was their mistake. Aaliyah opened her laptop. She wasn't done. Not even close. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something much, much bigger, and she was ready to carry it forward. Charles barely had time to process the latest testimony before a knock at the door shattered the moment. His assistant stepped in, face tight with urgency, a tablet clutched in her hands. You need to see this, she said, handing it over. Charles tapped play. The screen flickered to life, revealing a man in his early 40s, seated at a desk, his expression grave. His voice was steady, but emotions seeped through every word. I worked for the airline for 10 years, and I saw Natalie Parker harass passengers again and again. She always claimed it was policy, but we knew what it was. I reported her multiple times. Management did nothing. They knew. They always knew. A cold silence filled the room. Charles exhaled sharply, setting the tablet down. His gaze met Aaliyah's, intense, unwavering. This, he said, his voice low but charged with energy. This is exactly what we need. It's not just about what she did to you. It's about what they let her do to everyone. Aaliyah inhaled, steadying the storm raging inside her. Anger, sadness, resolve. They swirled together, hardening into something unshakable. They knew, she whispered, and they let it happen. Meanwhile, across the city, inside a sleek corporate boardroom drowning in tension, Rachel Bennett sat at the head of a long glass table. Senior executives surrounded her. their frustration thick in the air. "This is spiraling out of control," one of them snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "Former employees are coming forward, public backlash is growing, and now there's talk of a boycott. We need a plan." Rachel's voice was sharp, controlled. "First step, terminate Natalie Parker's contract. Unpaid leave isn't enough anymore. The public needs to see consequences." "And then what?" another executive demanded. "We throw her under the bus and hope it all blows over? What about Aaliyah Johnson? She's not backing down." Rachel's jaw tightened. "We'll make her an offer, a generous one. If she won't settle, we prepare for the fallout. If this goes to trial, it could destroy us." An executive leaned back, rubbing his temples. "So we sacrifice Natalie, make some empty promises about reviewing policies, and pray this doesn't stick?" Rachel didn't answer. She knew the truth. It wouldn't be enough. The fire had already spread too far. That evening, Aaliyah arrived, home to find Michael pacing outside her door, phone in hand, his expression taut with urgency. "Natalie Parker," he said the second he saw her. "She's been fired, effective immediately." Aaliyah arched a brow. "Let me guess. They think that'll make everything disappear?" Michael nodded. "But it's not working. People are still calling for an investigation into the airline itself." Good." Aaliyah unlocked her door, motioning for him to follow. "The more pressure, the better. They can't sweep this under the rug anymore." Inside, Michael pulled up his phone, handing it to her. "You're trending again." On the screen, a video of Aaliyah addressing reporters played, bold headlines flashing beneath it. "Aaliyah Johnson takes on airline discrimination." She studied the screen, then set the phone down, her expression unreadable. But in her eyes there was something unshaken, something determined. "They think firing Natalie is enough," she murmured. "They're wrong. This isn't about one person. It's about the system that let her thrive." Michael leaned against the counter, watching her with admiration. "So what's next?" Aaliyah met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "We keep pushing. We don't stop until they're forced to admit the truth." And the truth was this: Natalie Parker was never the whole problem. The real problem was the company that protected her, the system that allowed it, the silence that let it fester. And silence was no longer an option.